Most people who sit across from their doctor and ask about gray hair get one of two answers. The first is genetics, which is partly true and partly a conversation ender. The second is aging, which is also partly true and also partly a way of saying there's nothing to discuss. What almost never comes up is a specific blood test, a specific mineral, a specific biological mechanism that connects a measurable deficiency to the process by which your hair loses its color from the inside out. That mineral is copper. Not because copper is a miracle cure for gray hair. It isn't, but because copper sits at the center of the biochemical process that produces melanin, the pigment that gives hair its color, and because two separate published studies have measured serum copper levels in people with accelerated graying and found the same thing. Significantly lower copper concentrations compared to people who weren't graying. Most doctors don't test it. Most blood panels don't include it. And most people spending money on hair dye every 4 weeks have never been told it exists. Today we're covering the published science on copper and melanin production. What the research actually shows, why the zinc supplements so many people take daily may be quietly making this worse, and what an honest approach to this looks like. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit the bell. The next video covers a topical compound that was tested head-to-head against minoxidil in a multi-center clinical trial, and the results were not what the industry expected. Worth watching before you spend another $1 on a hair loss treatment. But first, let's start with what's inside every strand of colored hair, and why copper is more central to that process than most people realize. Every hair follicle that produces colored hair contains specialized cells called melanocytes. Their entire function is to manufacture melanin, the pigment that gives your hair its specific shade, whether that's black, brown, red, or blonde. Melanin doesn't just appear. It has to be built, step by step, through a specific biochemical process called melanogenesis. And at the center of that process is an enzyme called tyrosinase. Tyrosinase is the key that starts the engine. It takes the amino acid tyrosine, available from the protein you eat, and converts it through a series of reactions into melanin precursors that are then assembled into pigment and injected into the developing hair shaft. Here's the part most people never learn. Tyrosinase cannot function without copper as a cofactor, not as a bonus, not as a helper, as a structural requirement. Copper ions sit at the active site of the tyrosinase molecule. They are what allow the enzyme to carry out the oxidation reactions that melanin synthesis depends on. Without adequate copper, tyrosinase activity drops, melanin production slows, and hair that grows in without sufficient pigment appears gray, silver, or white. This is not a theory, it's established biochemistry, documented in the dermatological and biochemical literature. A 2025 study published in PLOS One, PubMed PMID 405 716, demonstrated in cell culture that copper supplementation significantly increased melanin production through enhanced tyrosinase activity. After 90 to 100 days of copper treatment, pigmentation was clearly visible in the treated cells, while the control cells without copper showed minimal pigmentation. Tyrosinase protein expression was significantly higher in the copper-treated group. The IP Indian Journal of Clinical and Experimental Dermatology confirmed the human parallel. Hypopigmentation of the skin and hair results from copper deficiency in humans, and this color change is directly associated with decreased activity of tyrosinase, the copper-containing enzyme required for melanin synthesis from tyrosine. Without copper, the enzyme can't work. Without a working enzyme, the factory shuts down. The hair grows in without color. That's the mechanism. Now here's the clinical evidence connecting copper levels in real people to actual graying. In 2012, researchers Fatemi Nayeni, Abrahimi, Vakilian, and Shahmoradi at Isfahan University of Medical Sciences in Iran published a study in Biological Trace Element Research, PubMed PMID 219799443. They measured serum iron, zinc, and copper concentrations in 66 patients with premature graying, and compared them to 66 age and sex-matched healthy controls. The copper finding was specific and statistically significant. The mean serum copper concentration in the graying group was 90.7 micrograms per deciliter, In the control group, it was 105.3. The difference, p equals 0.048, was statistically significant. People graying ahead of their expected timeline had measurably lower copper in their blood. A second study, published in the International Journal of Trichology in 2018 by El Sheikh and colleagues at Tanta University in Egypt, PubMed PMID 307833336, studied 60 patients with premature graying against 30 healthy age and sex-matched controls. They found reduced serum iron, copper, and calcium in the graying group compared to controls, and a statistically significant negative correlation between the severity of graying and copper levels. The more severe the graying, the lower the copper. Both studies were cited in a comprehensive 2025 review of premature graying published in the International Journal of Dermatology, PMC 12006/2, which confirmed copper as a crucial mineral for tyrosinase activity and melanin production in both eumelanin and pheomelanin. The honest context, these studies were conducted in specific populations, some involving younger individuals with premature graying rather than the typical age-related graying that occurs in people over 60. Correlation does not prove that correcting copper deficiency reverses gray hair. The evidence for that specific outcome is limited to case observations, not large controlled trials. What the research establishes clearly and consistently is that copper is biologically necessary for the melanin production process, and that people with accelerated graying tend to have lower copper levels than those without it. Now here's the hidden connection that most people never discover, and it may be the most actionable part of this entire video. If you take a zinc supplement daily, there is a documented mechanism through which it may be quietly depleting your copper. Zinc and copper share the same absorption pathway in the small intestine. They both bind to a protein called metallothionein, produced by intestinal cells to regulate mineral absorption. When zinc intake increases significantly, the gut responds by producing more metallothionein. And here's the problem. Metallothionein has a higher affinity for copper than for zinc. So as more metallothionein is produced to manage the elevated zinc, it preferentially binds copper first, trapping it inside intestinal cells that eventually shed into the feces, taking the copper with them. The result, excess zinc intake reduces copper absorption. This mechanism is documented in multiple published sources, including a 2023 paper in the British Journal of Clinical Pharmacology by Duncan and colleagues, which reviewed zinc-induced copper deficiency and described it as frequently overlooked, often not diagnosed until serious neurological symptoms appear. The American Journal of Medicine published a case in 2022 of a 66-year-old woman who developed undetectable copper levels and severe anemia after taking zinc supplements for immune support during the COVID-19 pandemic. She had no other explanation for the deficiency. This isn't a theoretical risk. It's a documented interaction that affects a measurable proportion of people who supplement zinc without balancing their copper intake. Why does this matter for gray hair specifically? Because zinc supplements are one of the most commonly taken supplements in adults over 50, often recommended for immune support, wound healing, and general aging. And most people taking them have never been told that consistent daily use above the recommended dietary allowance can suppress copper absorption over time. If you take more than 25 to 40 milligrams of zinc daily on a regular basis, and you're graying faster than your family history would predict, your copper levels may be worth discussing with a doctor. So what does a practical, honest approach to this look like? The first step is not buying a copper supplement. That's the same mistake people make with every nutrient discussed in this space, jumping to supplementation before knowing whether there's actually a deficiency. Excess copper creates its own problems, including oxidative stress and liver toxicity. This is a mineral where the difference between adequate and too much matters. The first step is asking for a serum copper test. It is a simple blood test. It is not routinely included in standard metabolic panels or comprehensive blood work in most clinical settings. You may need to specifically request it. If your doctor asks why, mentioning that research published in Biological Trace Element Research has linked lower serum copper to premature graying, and that you're taking zinc supplements regularly gives a clinically grounded reason to run the test. If the test comes back low, below the normal reference range for your lab, then Dietary correction is the most appropriate first approach. Foods that are naturally rich in copper include cashews, sunflower seeds, lentils, dark chocolate, shiitake mushrooms, and organ meats like beef liver. These provide copper in a form the body absorbs well, with far less risk of overshooting than supplementation. If you're taking zinc supplements and your copper comes back low, the most direct action is discussing with your doctor whether the zinc dose should be adjusted or whether copper should be supplemented alongside it. The general guidance from nutritional medicine is that a zinc to copper ratio of approximately 8 to 15 to 1 is considered reasonable, meaning for every 15 milligrams of zinc you take, you need at least 1 milligram of copper to maintain balance. If your copper comes back normal, then this specific mechanism is not your answer, and the investigation should focus elsewhere, which is exactly the point. Testing tells you whether you're spending your time and attention in the right place. One more piece of honest context before closing this out. Even when copper deficiency is identified and corrected, gray hair that is fully grown out will not reverse. The pigment that was never deposited in an existing strand cannot be added retroactively. What may change, in people whose melanocytes are still partially functional and whose deficiency is caught before permanent depletion, is the new growth coming in from the root. How long that takes to become visible depends on how fast your hair grows and how much new growth there is to assess. The typical rate is ½ an inch per month. You're looking at a 3 to 6 month window minimum before you can draw any conclusions about whether correction is having an effect on new pigmentation. And this applies only to people where copper deficiency is contributing to the graying. For someone whose graying is driven entirely by genetic programming and age-related melanocyte stem cell exhaustion, which is the case for most people, copper correction will not change the trajectory. That honest framing is what separates useful information from empty promise. Copper matters for melanin production. It is measurably lower in some people who gray prematurely. It can be quietly depleted by zinc supplements that millions of people take without knowing. And it can be tested with a simple blood test that most people have never had. Whether it's part of your picture is something a blood test can answer, and a dermatologist or physician can help interpret. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had your copper tested? Are you currently taking zinc supplements? The exchange in the comments on topics like this often surfaces information worth covering in future videos. Everything here is for educational purposes only and does not replace individualized medical advice. Before changing your supplement routine or requesting specific tests, talk to your doctor, especially if you're managing any ongoing health conditions. See you in the next one.